Hi everyone, welcome to yet another presentation. This one is on heredity. Eventually we will be looking into molecular genetics, which I will explain when we get there. But the idea behind this unit is how do we inherit traits from our parents, or how can we predict that? But some of the questions we're going to be trying to answer are, where do our traits come from? How do our genes interact? How can we figure out the probability of inheriting a certain trait? How can we use family history to predict genetic patterns? And then how do we go from DNA to traits and characteristics? So the first half of this unit, we're going to be focusing on questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the second half of this unit, we're going to be looking at question 5. All right, so let's talk about heredity. This is basically, it says it right here. Now I can put my face over my own face. This is the passing on of traits from parents to their offspring. So when we say traits and characteristics, we're talking about both physical and mental traits that can be passed from parent to offspring. So these are things like hair color, hair texture, your height, your skin color, your eye color, whether your teeth will grow in straight or crooked, how big your nose is, whether you have a hitchhiker's thumb or a straight thumb, whether you have free earlobes or attached earlobes, whether you have wet earwax or dry earwax. That's a real trait that you can inherit, by the way. But it's this idea that you can get these traits from your parents, and it's genetically, not just environmental or behavioral. And when I'm talking about traits, I'm talking about the characteristics of an organism. And so, like it says here, hair or skin color, your height, some of your personality traits, whether or not you're susceptible to certain diseases. So like the probability of you eventually developing cancer one day, that's a genetic heritable trait. So what you're seeing here, and hopefully what you realized from the last activity, these are my parents. This is my face over here that you're seeing speak right now. So hopefully you are able to see that my parents passed on some of their traits and characteristics to me through things that we look similar with. So you can see I'm wearing glasses, my dad's wearing glasses. My mom has dark hair. She does have curly hair, even though it's straight in this picture. I think face shape wise, I have the similar like face shape to my mom, but I might have a more similar like nose to my dad. It's up to you. You can decide. Anyway, just a reminder before we continue that human cells, so we are going to be talking mostly about human genetics here. So human cells, they contain 46 chromosomes in total, or 23 pairs of chromosomes, which means that I got 23 chromosomes from my dad and 23 chromosomes from my mom for a total of 46. So even though I may look more like one parent to you than the other, both of them did contribute equally to my genetics and my characteristics. And we're going to be getting into why I might look more like one parent or the other. There we go. So now I can move my face out of the way again. So before we get started, we need to also talk about this man called Gregor Mendel. And he actually was a monk. He lived in a monastery. That's where monks live. And a monastery is sort of like a little temple environment that's away from modern society. And so basically they don't need some of the same stuff that we need in modern society. So they fixate more on making sure that they grow enough crops to eat. They've chopped enough fire to burn for light and heat. So a lot of those types of activities. And so Gregor Mendel, like I said, he lived at this monastery as a monk, and his job was to work in the garden. And so because of this, it actually led him to becoming what we call the father of modern genetics. So we give this guy credit for figuring out basically all of what we're about to learn in this unit. But his thing was he was able to record and observe. So not only did he see this, he wrote it down. But he was able to observe how traits are passed from parent to offspring using plants, and specifically pea plants. So if you go to the grocery store and you see those little like snap peas or snow peas, and you can buy them and eat them as a snack, or even like green beans type of thing, we're talking about that type of plant. And so he looked at a bunch of different traits of this type of plant. So flower color, plant height, seed color, seed shape, pod color, pod shape, flower position, all these different traits he was able to observe in these plants. And then he was also able to record what was actually happening. He also did this by pollinating plants and what we call cross-pollinating. So this type of plant specifically has both a male and a female part attached to it. So basically he took like the male part of one plant and brushed it up against the female part of another plant and made some new baby plants out of that. But through that, he was able to observe these traits and characteristics that were passed from the parent plant to the baby plant. And then he was also able to observe some differences in these traits and characteristics. So before we get into observing these different traits and characteristics and observing heredity, we need to talk about this idea of probability. So probability is just the likelihood that a specific event will happen. So we can talk about this in terms of like who's going to win the Super Bowl. I don't even know the teams playing in the Super Bowl, but let's say that you think that, I'm going to go with Patriots because whatever. If you think the Patriots are going to win the Super Bowl, you can predict the probability. They can have like a 20% chance of winning the Super Bowl, or they can have a 50% chance of winning the Super Bowl. You can do the same thing when you're gambling or flipping a coin or playing dice. So if you flip a coin, you're going to have a 50% chance that it lands on heads and a 50% chance that it lands on tails. If you roll a die, just one, it's 6 sides. So you have a 1 in 6 chance of it rolling on a 2. These are all ideas of probability. So judging off of parents' genetics, we're able to actually predict the probability of the offspring inheriting a certain trait from the parents. So in order to calculate probability, it's just the number of one kind of possible outcome divided by the total number of possible outcomes. So let's talk about what this really means. And I did already give a couple of examples we're going to use. So if we look at a penny, for example, a coin, it has a heads and a tails. That's 2 sides. So it has a total of 2 possible outcomes. That would be your denominator on the bottom here. And if we wanted to calculate the probability of flipping heads, that would be 1 out of 2 sides. So heads is on one side. So that's the number of one kind of possible outcome would be a 1. Divided by the total number of possible outcomes, that'd be 2 because there's a heads and a tails. So 1 heads divided by 2 heads and tails, you get 1/2, 50% chance. It's a 50% possibility or 1 out of 2 probability that you can flip a coin and have it land on heads. So if we look at this with a die, like I was saying, a die has 6 sides. So total number of possible outcomes is 6. You have 6 different possibilities of happening. And then we're looking the probability of rolling a 6. So a 6 is on just one side of the die. So again, it would be one kind of possible outcome divided by 6 total different outcomes you could possibly get. So it's a 1 out of 6 chance, a 1 out of 6 probability of rolling a 6 on a die. So hopefully this seems relatively simple and easy to understand. When it comes to a human being, however, we inherit all of our traits at the same time. So we have like millions of different genes that we inherit on our 46 chromosomes, which means that when this happens, not only do we have to calculate the probability of one type of gene, we have to calculate the probability of all of our genes. We're not actually going to do this, but this is the idea behind it. So let's say as a human, we needed to know both the probability of your hair color and your hair texture. That's 2 completely different events happening. So essentially, we are able to predict a probability of both of these events happening at the same time, but it's two different events. So we have to calculate it differently. So when we have two separate events occurring at the same time, you multiply their individual probabilities. Okay, so let's go back to our dice example. For the probability of rolling a 3 and then a 1. Can we even see this? Nope. Oh, it's down here. It's hidden. So let's put this away. It's not letting me do that. All right, let's try this. There we go. So when we're looking at the probability of rolling a 3 and then a 1, rolling a 3, it's a 1 out of 6 chance. You have a 3 on one side of the die, and then there's 6 possible options, so 1 out of 3. Rolling a 1, same chance, 1 out of 6 probability. You have a 1 on one side of the die, and then there are 6 possible options, so 1 out of 6. So if you want to calculate rolling a 3, then a 1 at the same time, so you have 2 die and you roll them, you want to get a 3 and a 1, it's going to be 1/6 times 1/6. That's how you calculate it. So 1/6 out of 1/6, or words. When you multiply 1/6 by 1/6, you get 1 out of 36. So remember, when we are multiplying fractions, you multiply the numerator, the 1, so 1 times 1 is 1, and then you multiply the denominators, the bottom, so 6 times 6 is 36. That's where we're getting this probability from. Also, before we get into calculating these probabilities, there's sort of a lot of background we have to go over first. So we have to look at the vocabulary associated with this probability idea and this inheritance idea. And so these vocabulary words will make it easier. I'm trying to figure out where to put my face. I apologize. It'll make it easier for us to be able to talk about these concepts. Also, as a disclaimer, you do need to actually know this vocabulary to be successful for this unit. I'm going to be using a lot of these vocabulary words, just talking as if it's a normal conversation. So I am going to be referring back to these words a lot and constantly, which means that you need to know exactly what they mean. So the same way that you know and respond to your name when it is called, you need to know these words in the same way. So when we're talking about something that is purebred, this is talking about an organism whose offspring display the same traits as the parents. So you'll see this a lot with dogs and puppies. They'll say that this puppy is a purebred, whatever breed it is. So for example, my dog is a lab terrier mix. So he's not a purebred, but you could have a purebred lab retriever. And that means that the puppy looks exactly the same as the parents. So it has the same traits as the parents. When we're talking about different generations of people, because we are talking about parents and offspring, the P generation is always going to refer to as the parental generation or the first generation that we're talking about. So for example, your grandparents could be the P generation, right here, this is a family tree we're looking at. So this might be your grandparents up here. The F1 generation are the offspring of the P generation. So F1 might be your parents, this generation right here. And then the F2 generation would be the generation, or would be the offspring of the F1 generation. So this might be your generation down here. So your F2 down here, your parents are F1, your grandparents are P. And then if you have kids, your kids would be the F3 generation. And so that just keeps going. And again, you can start wherever you want to start. So your P generation could just be your parents. You could be the F1 generation. And then the F2 generation could be your kids. The F3 would be your grandkids. So it's wherever you start, that's just how we label things. When it comes to talking about different traits, like I was saying, we get 46 chromosomes. So 23 come from mom, 23 come from dad, which means you get 2 copies of every single gene. Mom gives you 1 copy of a gene, dad gives you the other copy of a gene. So if we look at this in terms of eye color, you can get a brown-eyed gene from mom and a blue-eyed gene from dad. They're both talking about eye color. They're both talking about the same trait, but there's different versions of these genes, different versions of these traits. those different versions are called alleles. So again, this is similar if you're talking about like cell phones. You can have the iPhone 8, the iPhone 10 or X, the iPhone Pro, whatever it's called. Those are different versions or different alleles of the iPhone. So same thing with genes and traits. You have different alleles, which are the same gene, just different versions. So with eye color, the trait or the gene would be eye color, and then the alleles would be like blue, brown, green, hazel, whatever else there is. Now, within these alleles, within these different versions of traits, you can have a dominant allele and you can have a recessive allele. So a dominant allele is your stronger allele. We tend to write this using big letters. Leave it. Thank you. We write the dominant trait using big letters or capital letters. And if a dominant allele is paired with a recessive allele, you are going to express the dominant allele. So what I mean by this is like the brown eye allele is dominant to the blue eye allele. So if you have one of each, your eyes are going to appear brown instead of blue, even if you have the blue-eyed allele. The opposite of that would be the recessive allele. So the blue-eyed gene or allele would be your recessive allele. And this is the allele that is weaker, and it's written in the little letters. So this is, again, just to show you, these are chromosomes right here. And so we're saying that we have a gene called A over here, and we have a dominant allele A, and we have a recessive allele A. And that's just showing you the different alleles within chromosomes and genes. All right, so again, when we put two alleles together, that's your full genetic code, right? Because you have two copies of every gene, so you need two alleles of every gene to have a complete gene. So if you have two of the same allele, so two dominant alleles or two recessive alleles, that is what we call homozygous. Homo means same. Heterozygous is where you have one of each. So one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Hetero means different, so that's why heterozygous is having one dominant and one recessive. Now, when we are talking about these alleles, genotype refers to the set of alleles for the organism. So the letters. So you're seeing like T's up here. The T's would be the genotype. However, the phenotype is the physical appearance that the alleles create. So if these T's stand for your ability to roll your tongue, tongue rolling, so tongue rolling is a dominant trait. So big T stands for tongue roll, little t stands for no tongue roll. The idea is that you can have big T, or little t. That would be homozygous dominant for the big T's, or homozygous recessive for the little t's. That would be the genome, the T's, but the ability to roll your tongue over here with the dominant alleles would be the phenotype. And then over here with the recessive alleles, the ability to not roll your tongue would be the other phenotype. So remember, the letters are the genotype. TT is the genotype. Tongue rolling or no tongue rolling is your phenotype. All right, so I'm going to pause here and give you a second to catch up on the vocab, and we're going to come back and actually apply some of this vocab to calculate probabilities of inheriting certain traits.